My mother told me our downstairs neighbor was dangerous and I should never speak to her, so I slipped a note under her door and asked for help. The woman who answered her door at 7:14 on a Wednesday morning was not what I expected. I had spent 3 weeks building a picture of her in my mind from my mother's descriptions. Dangerous, unstable, a woman with dark intentions toward children, someone who had made trouble for every family she'd ever lived near. What I actually found, when the door to apartment 4B swung inward, was a small Haitian-American woman in her early 60s wearing reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair, holding a mug of coffee in one hand and my note in the other. She looked at me for a long moment. She looked at the note. She looked at me again, taking in the dark rings under my eyes and the way I was standing with my weight distributed wrong, like someone who had been bracing for impact for so long that bracing had become their default posture. Then she said, in a voice that was quiet and precise and contained absolutely no performance of concern, just the real thing. "Come in, Owen. I've been hoping you would do exactly this." I crossed her threshold and my whole life changed. But I need to go back further, because the story doesn't start with the note. It starts with the pills. I had been living in apartment 6B of the Greystone Manor building in Hartford, Connecticut for 3 years when I wrote that note. 3 years and 4 months, to be exact. Since my mother, Diane Marsh, moved us there from our previous apartment in Wethersfield after she remarried and then unremarried in the span of 11 months, leaving us with a reduced income, a storage unit full of a stepfather's furniture, and my mother's very specific explanation of why our new building was perfect for us, except for one problem. The problem, she said the first week we moved in, was the woman in 4B. Her name was Celestine Aubert. My mother said Celestine had made trouble for the family on the 3rd floor before we arrived, had filed noise complaints against elderly residents, had a history of involving herself in other people's business in ways that were manipulative and calculated. My mother said she'd heard all of this from the building super, a man named Wendell, who my mother was very good at extracting information from because she was very good at extracting things from people in general. She told me to take a different staircase when possible to avoid passing Celestine's door. She told me not to make eye contact in the lobby. She told me that some people in this world had pathological tendencies, and that the measure of a smart person was recognizing those tendencies before they caused damage. My mother said things like this often. She said them with the calm authority of someone who had the full picture and was sharing it with you out of love. I was 13 when we moved in. I believed her completely. The pills were the first thing I noticed that I couldn't make fit the picture my mother had built. I want to be careful here because I need you to understand how this works, how the picture gets built over years of small specific brushstrokes until it becomes the only picture you know how to look through. My mother was a healthcare administrator at a regional clinic. She was organized, articulate, well-dressed, and had the particular social intelligence of someone who understood exactly how they were being perceived at every moment and who worked constantly to manage that perception. She had friends who adored her. She had colleagues who respected her. She had a pediatrician for me named Dr. Francis Obina, who had been seeing me since I was 4, and who, by the time I was 14, was treating me for what my mother described as a complex constellation of conditions that had always been present but were now being properly managed: a fatigue disorder, periodic cardiac irregularities, digestive dysfunction, and a generalized anxiety presentation that my mother said explained my social withdrawal and academic inconsistency. I took 4 medications daily. I had been taking them in various combinations since I was 11, when my mother had found a new specialist willing to prescribe more aggressively after our previous doctor retired. I was tired all the time. My hands shook sometimes in the mornings. I had missed so much school across the previous 3 years that I was doing a hybrid program, half online and half in person, that my mother had arranged with the district by providing documentation from Dr. Obina about the severity of my conditions. I knew I was sick. My mother had explained it to me thoroughly enough times that the explanation had the quality of a truth I remembered rather than one I had been told. The first pill that made me notice something was a small oblong capsule that appeared in my morning medication container in October of my 2nd year in the building, about 16 months after we moved in. It was slightly different in color from the capsule it had apparently replaced, a shade off, the kind of difference you don't notice if you're not paying close attention. I was paying close attention that particular morning because I had spent the night reading about the medications I was on after a bout of insomnia sent me to my laptop at 2 a.m. with the specific restlessness that I'd learned to treat as productive rather than distressing. I had been reading the drug information for one of my prescriptions, the one for the cardiac irregularities, and I had found something that sat wrong in my chest in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. The medication's listed side effects included fatigue, tremor, and digestive disruption, the exact symptoms it was supposedly treating. I had sat with that for a while before I went back to sleep, and in the morning when I saw the different capsule, I held it up to the window and looked at it for a long time. And then I put it in my mouth and swallowed it because I had been taught that not taking my medications was dangerous, and because the alternative, the thing I was starting to consider without being able to say it clearly yet, was too large to look at directly. I told myself I had imagined the difference. I took the pill. By noon, I was nauseated in a way I hadn't been in months, and by evening, I had what my mother called one of my episodes, which was her word for the specific combination of dizziness and palpitations that had sent us to the emergency room 3 times in the past 2 years, and that always, afterward, produced a new round of appointments and adjusted prescriptions. And my mother, explaining to doctors and teachers and concerned neighbors the difficult nature of my health situation. And the second thing I noticed came 6 weeks later when I found a receipt. My mother was meticulous about most things, but she was a paper-based person in a digital world, which meant physical receipts lived in her purse and then in a shoebox in her closet before being periodically sorted. I wasn't searching her things intentionally. I had gone into her closet to retrieve a sweater she'd borrowed from me, and the shoebox had fallen off the upper shelf when I reached past it, scattering receipts across the closet floor. I picked them up and found one from a pharmacy I didn't recognize, not the CVS on Farmington Avenue that we normally used, but a smaller independent pharmacy in Bloomfield that was 20 minutes from our apartment. The receipt was for 2 medications. One was a sleep aid I recognized, while the other was a compound prescription, the specific kind that has to be made to order, under my name, for a dosage that wasn't in any of my official prescription records. I stood in my mother's closet holding that receipt for a long time. My hands were doing the thing where they shook slightly, and I couldn't tell if it was the medication or my body responding to something my mind was trying not to finish thinking. I put the receipt back in the shoebox. I put the shoebox back on the shelf. I went to my room and sat on my bed and opened my laptop and typed into the search bar words I had been circling for weeks without landing on. Munchausen by proxy symptoms in children. I read for 2 hours. And then I closed the laptop and went to dinner and ate the food my mother had cooked and said the right things and went back to my room and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling because the thing I had been afraid to look at directly was now directly in front of me and I couldn't look away. Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which clinicians now call factitious disorder imposed on another, a name that is more accurate and somehow more terrible, is a form of abuse in which a caregiver, typically a parent, fabricates or induces illness in a person under their care, typically a child, in order to receive medical attention, sympathy, and the identity of a devoted caregiver managing a difficult situation. I had never heard of it before I searched for it. By the time I finished reading that night, I understood it better than I wanted to. I understood the profile of the caregiver: organized, medically knowledgeable, well-regarded in their community, skilled at presenting as concerned and self-sacrificing. I understood the profile of the child: isolated from peers, dependent on the caregiver, often genuinely experiencing symptoms because the caregiver is administering substances that produce them. I understood the way it worked in medical systems: doctor shopping until you find practitioners who trust the parent's account, meticulous record-keeping that builds a case history so thick and detailed that questioning it feels cruel. I sat with all of this and felt something that I can only describe as the sensation of a building you've lived in your whole life being revealed as a stage set. Every wall still standing, every object in its place. But the thing behind it all suddenly and permanently changed. I was 15 years old. I had been sick, genuinely, provably sick, for 4 years. And the person who had managed my care with such devoted attention, the person who knew every symptom and every medication and every doctor's name, the person who sat beside my bed during episodes and held my hand in waiting rooms and explained my condition to every new adult who entered my life. That person had a receipt from a pharmacy in Bloomfield for a compound prescription in my name that did not appear anywhere in my official records. I thought about going to Dr. Obina. I thought about this for 3 days, turning it over from every angle, and I kept arriving at the same problem. My mother had built my medical history herself, through years of presenting and documenting and managing, and Dr. Obina's picture of me was her picture. She had been in the room for every appointment I could remember. She had answered most of the direct questions. She had provided the context that shaped everything else. If I walked into his office without her and said what I was starting to understand, I was a 15-year-old child contradicting a decade of his own records and his own direct observations. I thought about going to a teacher. My access to teachers was limited by the hybrid program structure, and the teachers I had the most contact with had all at some point received documentation from my mother about my health situation. I had seen her providing it, had heard her explaining my absences with the patient, burdened grace of a woman managing more than most people could handle. I thought about calling a hotline, where I had looked them up, found the numbers, held my phone in my hand in my bedroom on a Friday afternoon while my mother was at work, and then put the phone down because I understood, from everything I'd read about this, that a phone call without documentation and without a trusted adult in my corner would enter a system that was built to investigate families, and that my mother was extremely good at managing the way she appeared to people who investigated families. I needed someone who was already outside the picture she had built. I needed someone she hadn't been able to reach first. I needed the woman in 4B. I want to be honest about why I chose Celestine specifically. It wasn't strategic exactly. It was the combination of two things. The fact that my mother had been so specifically and repeatedly insistent that I avoid her, and something I had noticed on my own that I had filed away without knowing I was filing it. 6 months after we moved in, I had come home from a rare full day at school to find the building's lobby occupied by two people having a conversation that stopped when I walked in. Celestine Aubert and Wendell the Super, both looking at me with expressions I couldn't read. Wendell had looked away quickly. Celestine had not looked away. She had looked at me steadily for a moment, and then said hello with a directness that was nothing like the dangerous instability my mother had described, and I had said hello back quickly and gone upstairs and not thought about it again for a year. But I thought about it now. The steadiness. The way she had not performed concern or warmth or anything, just looked at me like she was actually seeing me. And the fact that Wendell had looked away quickly, which told me something had been happening in that lobby before I arrived that someone did not want me to know about. My mother had gotten to Wendell. She had built the picture for him early, but the picture hadn't worked on Celestine, which was probably exactly why my mother was so insistent that Celestine was dangerous. The people my mother couldn't manage were the people she needed me to avoid. The logic of it, once I saw it, was so clean it was almost elegant. I wrote the note on a Thursday evening in March, sitting at my desk while my mother watched television in the living room. I used a piece of paper torn from the back of a notebook, and I kept the note short because I didn't know how to make it longer without either saying too much or saying too little. I wrote, "My name is Owen Marsh. I live in 6B. I think something is wrong with what my mother has been doing to me medically, and I don't know who to trust. My mother told me you were dangerous. I think she told me that because you're the opposite. Please don't tell her I wrote this. I'll come to your door at 7 a.m. on Wednesday if I don't hear from you. Owen." I read it 4 times. I folded it twice. I waited until my mother was in the shower, then walked down 2 flights in my socks as quietly as I had ever moved in my life, slid the note under the door of apartment 4B, and walked back upstairs and got into bed and did not sleep. Not that night, and not most of the nights that followed, because the thing I had set in motion was now in motion, and whatever happened next was going to be either salvation or the worst miscalculation of my short life, and I had no way to know which until I showed up at that door. Celestine Aubert was 62 years old and had spent 31 years as a licensed clinical social worker specializing in child welfare, the last 14 of them as a senior investigator for the Connecticut Department of Children and Families before she retired in 2019 with a reputation and a caseload history that, as I would later learn, was essentially unimpeachable. She had moved to Greystone Manor 8 months before we did, coming from a house in West Hartford that she'd shared with her late husband, and she had encountered Diane Marsh within 2 weeks of our arrival. What she told me that Wednesday morning: over coffee she made me and food she put in front of me because she said I looked like I hadn't been eating enough, was that she had been watching for 3 years. Not surveilling, she was careful to say. Watching. The way a person with 31 years of professional pattern recognition watches when the patterns around her activate something she spent a career learning to identify. She said she had tried once to speak to Wendell about what she was observing, and that Wendell had been pleasant and had clearly been given a version of her that made him unreceptive. She said she had tried to speak to another resident who had seemed concerned about me, an older man on the 5th floor named Harold, and that Harold had been similarly inoculated. She said she had known, yet with the specific knowledge of someone who has spent decades in this work, that she would not be the one to make the first contact. It had to be me. And she had been waiting for me to be ready. My note, she said, placing it on the table between us, with the care of someone who understood that it was already evidence, was the bravest document she had seen in a long time. And she had seen a great many brave documents. She did not tell me everything was going to be fine. I want to be precise about that because it was the thing that told me I had been right to trust her. Every adult in my life up to that point who had been operating under my mother's version of events had a quality of reassurance that, looking back, was the reassurance of people managing me toward a predetermined conclusion. Celestine did not reassure. She informed. She told me what the process would look like. She told me where it was likely to be difficult. She told me that the system we were about to engage was imperfect and that my mother was skilled at navigating it, and that the documentation we built together in the coming days would be the difference between an investigation that led somewhere and one that got managed away. She asked me what I had. I told her about the receipt. She asked if I had it. I told her I had taken a photo of it on my phone 2 weeks earlier and had been keeping the phone hidden in a box under my bed inside a winter jacket I never wore. She nodded and asked me to send the photo to an email address she wrote on a piece of paper. She said she was going to make a call that morning. She said the call was to a woman she trusted who was still active in the DCF system and who would know how to handle the intake in a way that routed it away from the offices my mother had any relationship with. She said I needed to go back upstairs and behave normally for as long as normal was possible, which she estimated was a matter of days at most. She said I should not take my medications today and should tell my mother I had already taken them. She said to document anything she could, take photos of pill bottles, of receipts, of anything unusual, and to be careful. I asked her why she hadn't come to me sooner. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "Because coming to you would have been the thing your mother was waiting for. You coming to me was the only version of this that could work." I finished my coffee. I went back upstairs. Normal. For now. The call Celestine made that Wednesday morning was to a woman named Adaiora Nwosu, who had been a DCF child protective investigator for 18 years, and who was, in Celestine's words, exactly the kind of person you wanted on the intake end of a case like this, experienced specifically with medical child abuse, professionally skeptical in the direction of caregiver narratives rather than child narratives, and known within the department for the thoroughness of her documentation chains. Adaiora drove to Celestine's apartment on Thursday evening after my mother left for a work event, and I came back downstairs and met her at Celestine's kitchen table. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 50s who wore her reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and who took notes on a legal pad with a green pen, and who asked me questions with the precision of someone who had learned exactly which questions opened things up and which ones closed them down. She asked about the history of my diagnoses chronologically. She asked about medication changes and who initiated them. She asked about the pharmacy in Bloomfield and whether I knew of any others. She asked about the episodes, the cardiac ones, and when they typically occurred, and what preceded them. She was particularly interested in the pattern of episodes preceding school absences and medical appointments, which was a pattern I had never consciously mapped, but which, when she laid it out from the timeline I described, had a shape that made my stomach drop. The episodes clustered in the 48 hours before significant events, before school meetings, before appointments with new specialists, before family occasions where my visibility to outside adults would be highest. The episodes that produced the most dramatic medical responses were the ones that resulted in ER visits that produced the most detailed new documentation. Adaiora wrote everything in the green pen, and at the end of 2 hours, she closed her pad and said she was opening a formal investigation under Protocol 12, which she explained was DC Eve's designated pathway for suspected factitious disorder imposed on another, meaning the case would be handled by a specialized unit rather than through general intake. While she said she needed me to continue at home for now because removing me immediately without sufficient cause would give my mother grounds to challenge the process, and because the investigation needed time to build a record that could survive that challenge. She said she was going to need the pharmacy receipt photo and anything else I could document. She said she would be in contact through Celestine. I asked how long. She said she couldn't give me a number, but that I should think in terms of weeks rather than months. She was wrong about that. It was 11 days. The 11 days were the hardest of my life, which I realize sounds like an exaggeration given what the preceding 4 years had apparently been, but I mean it in a specific way. It's in those 11 days I had to perform normal with the knowledge that normal was a lie I was complicit in, and that my mother, who was not stupid, who was in fact extraordinarily intelligent in the specific way of people who have made a science of understanding other people's perceptions, might at any moment notice something in me that told her the picture had shifted. I took my medications selectively, pocketing certain ones and tracking carefully what I actually swallowed. I noticed on the 3rd day that I was less nauseated than usual and that my hands shook less in the mornings. I noticed on the 6th day that I had more energy than I had felt in years, the kind of energy that is not excitement or happiness, but simply the normal baseline of a body operating without whatever had been depressing it. And that noticing this made me have to leave the dinner table and go to the bathroom and sit on the floor for 10 minutes with my back against the wall until I could return to the table without my face showing everything. I documented everything I could reach. I photographed the medication containers. I photographed the secondary pill organizer my mother kept in her top dresser drawer, which she used to prepare my morning and evening doses, which I had always understood as an act of careful management and which I now understood differently. I found 2 more receipts in the shoebox in her closet from 2 different pharmacies, one in Glastonbury and one in New Britain, both for compound prescriptions in my name. I photographed them and sent them to Celestine's email in batches of 3, and that's in the evenings when my mother was watching television from the box under my bed inside the winter jacket. On the 7th day, my mother came into my room in the morning before I was fully awake and said she thought I was looking better lately and asked if I was sleeping well. I said yes. She touched my forehead. She said she wanted to make an appointment with Dr. Abina because she'd been tracking my vitals in her log and she thought there might be an adjustment needed. I said okay. She left. I lay very still and breathed. 11 days. On day 9, Celestine knocked on my door while my mother was at work. I had given her my number through Adaora, and she texted me first to make sure the coast was clear. She came upstairs, which she had never done before, and sat in my room while I showed her the photos on my phone. And when she looked at each one with the focused attention of someone evaluating evidence, which is what she was doing. She told me Adaora had been building the external case in parallel, interviewing Dr. Abina, which had apparently been a very significant conversation, contacting the pharmacies in Bloomfield and Glastonbury and New Britain, reviewing the ER records from the 3 hospital visits against the prescription records available in the medical database. She said the external picture was corroborating what I had described and that the investigative team was going to be requesting access to my official medical records across all providers through a formal court order, which meant a judge had already reviewed an affidavit and found probable cause. She said there was also a detective involved now, a woman named Kezia Drummond, who worked the Hartford Police Department's Crimes Against Children unit, and who had 15 years of experience, and who Adaora described as someone who was going to want to speak with me directly. She said this was moving toward a formal removal and intervention, and that I should be prepared for it to happen within days. She also said something that I have thought about many times since. She said, I want you to understand that what you're feeling right now, the thing that makes you want to protect her even while you know what she's done, that is not weakness, and it is not confusion. That is what love does when it gets built on top of something wrong. It doesn't go away just because you know the truth. It just has to find somewhere new to land. I sat on my bed and looked at the winter jacket hanging out of the box underneath it and said nothing for a while. Then I said, is she going to go to prison? Celestine said she didn't know yet and that she was going to be honest with me through every stage of this, including the stages where she didn't know. I told her that was enough. Detective Kezia Drummond came to Celestine's apartment on day 10, a Saturday afternoon, while my mother was at a birthday lunch for a colleague that had been scheduled for weeks and that I had been tracking on the kitchen calendar like a lifeline. Drummond was a compact black woman in her mid-40s who wore no jewelry except small gold studs and who carried a leather portfolio that she placed on Celestine's coffee table with the practiced ease of someone who had done this specific kind of meeting many times. She had a calm that was different from Celestine's calm, less warm, more architectural, the calm of someone who had built a professional structure around a subject that required absolute steadiness to investigate without losing yourself. She introduced herself and explained that she was coordinating with DCF and that the criminal and child welfare investigations were running on parallel tracks, which she said was standard for suspected medical child abuse cases. She told me I was the victim in a criminal investigation and that my rights in this process included having an advocate present, which Celestine was serving as, and that I could stop the interview at any time. She asked if I understood. I said yes. She asked me to tell her, in as much detail as I could manage, the history of my medical treatment from the point where I first noticed something wrong. I talked for an hour and 40 minutes. Drummond wrote everything and asked clarifying questions that were so specific and so well-timed that I understood she already knew more than she was showing me. She was building a recorded account that matched against documentation her team had already assembled, creating a chain of corroboration. At one point, she asked me about a specific ER visit from November of the year before. A night I remembered clearly because the symptoms had been severe and my mother had been extremely distressed in the waiting room in a way that had made several nurses come to check on her. I described the night in detail. Drummond made a note and said, the ER report from that visit notes a specific compound that was detected in your blood work, but was documented by your mother as a medication you were currently prescribed. The pharmacy records we've obtained show that prescription was filled the day before the visit. She said it without inflection, stating a fact. I looked at her. I said, she gave it to me that night. Drummond wrote it down and moved to the next question. Gone. The last illusion gone. Just like that. Day 11 was a Monday. My mother left for work at 7:45. At 9:30, Adara Nwosu arrived at our building with a DCF team and a court order for an emergency removal pending investigation. She also arrived with a Hartford Police Department officer who was there to serve a warrant connected to Drummond's parallel investigation. I had been told they were coming and had been told to stay in Celestine's apartment, which is where I was when I heard movement in the hallway above me, and understood that it was happening. Celestine made tea and sat with me, and we didn't talk much. After 40 minutes, Adaora knocked on Celestine's door. She came in, sat down, and told me what had been found in the apartment. The medication storage areas had been photographed and inventoried. The second pill organizer from my mother's dresser had been collected as evidence, along with 3 pill bottles from a cabinet in the bathroom that were not in any of my documented prescription records. The shoebox had been collected. A locked box in the top of my mother's closet that I had not known existed had been opened with bolt cutters and had contained documentation, handwritten records in my mother's specific organized system, tracking my symptoms and her observations and medication adjustments, a log that went back 4 years, and that Adaora, who had read a lot of these documents in her career, said was the most meticulous example of its kind she had encountered. She said it was the kind of documentation that was meant to look like a devoted parent's medical journal, and that instead read, to a trained eye, as operational planning. She said there was enough in what they had found to support criminal charges, and that the detectives unit would be moving forward on that track. She said I would be placed with a DCF-approved emergency foster family in Hartford while the investigation proceeded and while the family court determined longer-term placement. She asked how I was doing. I said I was okay. I meant it in the way that okay means I am upright and functioning, and the thing I feared most has happened, and I am still here, which is a different kind of okay from the ordinary kind, but counts just as much. My mother was arrested at her workplace at 11:15 that Monday morning. I know this because Drummond's office called Celestine to inform her, as my advocate of record, and Celestine told me quietly while I was packing a bag in my room. The charge was risk of injury to a minor and criminal possession of a prescription drug, with additional charges pending review of the full evidence. I packed 2 bags. I took the winter jacket. I took my laptop. I took a photograph from my bookshelf that I had always thought of as one of my favorites. Me and my mother at the shore in Rhode Island when I was 9. Before any of this started, when I was healthy, and she was just my mother, and the world was still the size of a day at the beach. I stood holding that photograph for a long time. Then I put it in the bag because I wasn't sure yet what I wanted to do with it, and because I wasn't ready to make that decision on top of every other decision the day required. Celestine drove me to the emergency foster placement herself. The foster family, a couple named the Obianwus, Uchidi and Felicia, who had been fostering for 11 years and who met me at their front door with the specific warmth of people who understood that warmth was not the same as overwhelm, and that what a child arriving in this circumstance needed was space more than anything else. Said my room was ready, and dinner was at 6, and there was no pressure on anything. Chidi showed me the room. It was clean and quiet, and the window looked out at a backyard with a large oak tree. I put my bags down. I sat on the bed. Through the window, the oak tree moved in a March wind that was still cold but had the quality of something that was going to become something else soon. I sat there for a long time, doing nothing, which was the most productive thing I had done in years. The weeks that followed were not simple or clean, which I think is important to say because I've read accounts of situations like mine that describe the aftermath as primarily relief, and relief was part of it, a real and physical part. I felt my body changing in ways I could track, more energy and less nausea and mornings without the tremor in my hands. Changes that Adaora had arranged for a physician named Dr. Simone Tran, who had 10 years of experience in medical abuse recovery and who was now overseeing my actual care, to document systematically as evidence of what removing the prescribed substances had done. Dr. Tran was methodical and kind and spoke to me directly without routing anything through an adult interpreter of my experience. Which was so novel that the first few appointments I kept waiting for the moment when she would turn to someone else and start talking about me as though I had left the room. She never did. She said my baseline health, now that we were removing the substances that had been administered to produce symptoms, was good. I had no underlying cardiac condition, no diagnosed fatigue disorder, no digestive dysfunction that wasn't entirely explained by what had been going into my body. She said the anxiety was real and would need support, and that some of it was situational, and some of it had probably been induced chemically, and that distinguishing those two things would take time, and that time was fine. She said I was going to be okay. She said it in the way that doctors say things when they mean them, rather than when they're managing you toward feeling a certain way, and I believed her in that same register. The legal process was slower and more complicated than the initial arrest suggested it might be. My mother was represented by an attorney named Colin Farquhar, who was experienced in complex family court cases and who entered a not guilty plea and proceeded to challenge the admissibility of the medication log found in the locked box, arguing it was personal medical notation made in a caregiving context and not evidence of criminal intent. Drummond's unit countered with the pharmacy records from Bloomfield, Glastonbury, and New Britain, which showed prescriptions filled at facilities my mother had never disclosed to any of my treating physicians under my name, Almer for compounds that were not part of any treatment plan on record. The chain of custody for all 3 sets of pharmacy records was documented in what the assistant state's attorney, a woman named Priya Mehta, with 17 years in the prosecutor's office and a specific history with medical child abuse cases, described to Adora as a nearly airtight evidentiary foundation. Mehta was the 3rd professional in this chain, after Celestine and Adora, whose particular expertise was what made the difference, because Farquhar's defense strategy relied on creating ambiguity about my mother's intent. Duma and Mehta had spent 17 years closing exactly that ambiguity with pharmacy records and medical documentation and the testimony of physicians who could explain to a jury what the compounds in question did and why a parent would administer them covertly. Dr. Obinna, who had been my physician for over a decade, and who had been, in some measure, the unwitting instrument of my mother's management of the medical narrative, gave a statement to Drummond's unit and then to the prosecutor's office that I am told was both thorough and, in his own words, something he would carry for the rest of his professional life. He had not known. The system had not given him the tools to know, because my mother had been more careful than the system was designed to anticipate. But he had not known, and he said so clearly. Almer and the clarity of that admission became part of the record in a way that helped rather than complicated the prosecution's case. Dr. Tran referred me to a therapist named Marguerite Holloway, who worked specifically with adolescent survivors of medical abuse and who had a practice in West Hartford that I got to twice a week via Felicia Obianwu's car for the first 3 months, and then by myself on the bus once I had the bandwidth and the transit knowledge to manage it. Marguerite was a tall woman in her late 40s who had the quality of attention I had come to associate with professionals who were actually good at what they did rather than just credentialed in it. Present, unhurried, interested in what I thought rather than what I was supposed to think. Okay, we spent the first several sessions mapping what she called the architecture of my understanding, which meant building a clear picture of which of my beliefs about myself and the world had been constructed by my mother, and which had come from other sources, and what I actually thought when I stripped the constructed ones away. This was harder and took longer than the physical recovery because the physical recovery had the advantage of being measurable. I could watch my hands stop shaking, could feel my energy return, could track the weeks since my last nausea episode. The psychological architecture didn't announce its changes. It shifted quietly, and I often didn't know it had shifted until I said something in a session and heard my own words and thought, I didn't think that 2 months ago. Progress looked like that. Just small and sideways and sometimes only visible in retrospect. Marguerite said this was exactly right, and that I should not expect any other kind. The family court proceedings ran parallel to the criminal case. The family court judge, a woman named Honorable Constance Baptiste, who had been on the family bench for 22 years, and who Adora described as rigorous and fair in a specific way that meant she would not be moved by a good performance, reviewed the full evidence package and made an interim order that kept me in the Obianwu placement with supervised contact provisions for my mother pending the outcome of the criminal case. My mother's attorney argued for unsupervised contact on the grounds that the criminal charges were contested and that Diane Marsh had been my primary caregiver for 15 years and had no history of physical violence. Mehta's office submitted a response that argued, correctly, that the relevant risk was not physical violence, but the specific pattern of conduct under investigation, and that supervised contact was the appropriate standard until the court had a definitive finding. Judge Baptiste agreed. Supervised contact happened twice in the following months, in a DCF facility with an advocate present. And I will not describe those visits in detail, because some things belong to me privately, and those are 2 of them. What I will say is that my mother did not confess and did not break down and did not become a different person. She was, and in both visits, the version of herself she had always been when she wanted something. Composed, warm, carefully specific in her expressions of love, managing the room and managing me with the same skill she had always brought to managing rooms and people. The difference was that I could see it now. I could see the mechanism of it, the way the warmth was deployed rather than simply felt. Watching it from outside the picture she had built was one of the strangest experiences of my life. I told Marguerite about it. She said, "What you're describing is clarity. It hurts because clarity about the people we love always does. But you're not inside the picture anymore, Owen. You're looking at it. Now, that's something you did. Chidi and Felicia Obianwu were patient in a way that I had not experienced before, and that I struggled to characterize for the first several weeks until Marguerite gave me the word for it. Unconditional. The patience was unconditional, which was different from the patience my mother had displayed, which had always had a direction. Patient toward the version of events she was building, impatient with anything that interrupted it. Chidi was an engineer who cooked elaborate Nigerian dishes on weekends and who taught me to play chess badly and then better over the course of 4 months of Sunday afternoons. Felicia was a retired nurse who had specific and useful things to say about my physical recovery that were neither clinical nor managed, just honest. Alpha from someone who had held a lot of hands in medical settings and knew what bodies looked like when they were healing. They had 2 other foster children in the house, both younger than me, and the household ran on a structure that was clear without being rigid, scheduled without being managed. I ate dinner at a table every night with people who asked about my day because they wanted to know the answer. I had a key to the front door. No one came into my room without knocking. These things sound ordinary. They were extraordinary. They were, I slowly understood, what ordinary was supposed to feel like, and I had not known that because I had never had it uninterrupted. My mother's criminal trial was set for 8 months after her arrest. In the weeks preceding it, Farquhar entered into plea negotiations with Meda's office, a development that Adaiora described to me in advance so that I was not blindsided by it, explaining that plea negotiations in cases like this were common and did not mean the charges were being minimized. The negotiation produced an offer, a guilty plea to risk of injury to a minor, with the additional charges reduced to a single charge of criminal tampering in the first degree related to the pharmacy records, in exchange for a sentence recommendation of 3 years, followed by 5 years of probation with specific conditions including no unsupervised contact with minors, mandatory participation in a treatment program for the underlying psychiatric condition, and a permanent notation in the criminal record that would trigger review in any future professional context involving children or healthcare. Meda's office reviewed the offer with Drummond and with Adaiora and with me, because I was now 16 and had a legal right to be consulted about plea decisions in the case. I met with Meda herself in her office on a Wednesday afternoon, a meeting that took an hour and that Celestine attended as my advocate. Meda explained the offer and the alternative, which was a full trial that she was confident of winning, but that would require me to testify, and that would take a year to reach at minimum. She did not tell me what to recommend. She said the decision was the prosecutor's office's to make, but that my perspective was part of their consideration. I thought about it for 3 days. I talked to Marguerite. I talked to Celestine. I talked to Chidi on a Sunday afternoon over the chessboard. Well, not about the specific details, but about the general question of what you do when the person who hurt you is also the person who built you, and you have to decide what consequence is fair. He said, you decide what you can live with, not what they deserve. Those are different questions, and only one of them is yours to answer. I called Meda's office on a Thursday morning and said I supported the plea agreement if it served the prosecution's assessment of appropriate justice. The plea was entered 3 weeks later. My mother appeared before Judge Baptiste and said the words required of her in the specific quiet voice she used for things she had prepared thoroughly. She received the sentence recommendation. She was taken into custody. I was not in the courtroom. I was in Marguerite's office. He's sitting in the chair I had sat in twice a week for 7 months, waiting. Celestine called me when it was done, because I had asked her to be the one to call. She said it simply. The plea had been entered and accepted, and the sentence had been imposed. She asked how I was. I said I was okay. She said she knew and that it was going to keep getting more okay from here. I said I hoped so. She said hope was the right instrument for this particular moment and that she was proud of me in a way that she wanted me to understand was not about the outcome of the case, but about the note. The note I had written on a piece of paper from the back of a notebook on a Thursday evening when I was 15 and frightened and had run out of adults I could trust. She said the whole thing, everything that had followed. Every agency and every investigation and every piece of documentation and every conversation in every office. All of it started with a boy who looked at the one person his mother had told him was dangerous and decided, with the specific courage that lives in the intersection of desperation and intelligence, that dangerous was exactly what he needed. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "She called you dangerous because you were. Just not to me." Celestine laughed, the warm, specific laugh of someone who has been in this work long enough to know that the moments of dark comedy are when you know you're really going to be okay. I laughed too. We stayed on the phone for a while, just sitting with it. The year that followed was the first year of my life that I can describe without organizing it around a medical event or an episode or an absence or an explanation of my condition to someone new. I went back to school full time. I was behind in some areas and ahead in others in ways that were interesting to map once I had the energy and the cognitive clarity to map them. The years of enforced isolation and homebound learning had produced in me a reading depth and a research ability that my new school's academic team found surprising, and that felt, now that I could deploy them freely, like discovering muscles you'd built without knowing you were building them. I made friends slowly, and then less slowly. I had a best friend by the end of the year, a kid named Devraj, whose family had moved from Mumbai 3 years earlier, and who had a quality of perceptive calm that reminded me, in a way I recognized without being able to fully articulate, of Celestine. I told him the whole story over the course of a month of after-school conversations. He listened without performing a reaction to any of it, which was exactly right. He said, "You should write it down someday, not for anyone else, just so you have it as a document, because you're a person who does well with documentation." He was correct, and I appreciated that he knew it. Celestine and I had dinner together every other week for the rest of the year I was in the Obianwu placement, sometimes at her apartment and sometimes at a restaurant in Frog Hollow that she liked, on a Haitian place that she said had the closest thing to her mother's jumu she'd found outside of her own kitchen. She told me about her career, the cases she'd seen, the ones that had resolved well and the ones that hadn't, the particular exhaustion of 31 years in a field that required you to see the worst that people did to children while still believing that the children were going to be okay, which she said required a different kind of faith than any other kind she knew. She asked about my sessions with Marguerite and what I was discovering about myself now that the constructed architecture was being dismantled piece by piece. And I told her that the most surprising thing was how much of me had survived intact underneath it, that I had opinions about things and humor about things and a perspective on things that were genuinely mine and had been mine even when they were surrounded by my mother's version of everything. She said that was the most important thing to know, and that a lot of people who came through what I had come through spent years mourning what had been taken and forgot to notice what hadn't been. She said I was, in her professional and personal assessment, going to do very well. I told her she was the most useful, dangerous woman I had ever met. She said she would take that. The Obianus asked me 6 months after I moved in whether I would consider a longer-term placement with them. They said they weren't rushing anything, and that no decision needed to be made immediately, and that the question was simply open. I said I needed to think about it, and I did think about it for 2 weeks, during which I noticed that thinking about it felt different from anything I had expected, which was that it felt like a real choice, an actual, unburdened, open-ended choice that I was making from a position of safety rather than desperation, and that this was new enough that I needed time to get used to the feeling before I could answer the question. I told them yes on a Sunday morning while Chidi was making jollof rice, and Felicia was doing the crossword at the kitchen table, and the 2 younger kids were running something complicated with blocks in the living room. I said it in the kitchen doorway. Chidi turned around. Felicia put down her pen. There were no theatrics about it. Chidi said good and turned back to the rice. Felicia smiled the smile of a woman who had been doing this for 11 years and knew exactly what a yes said from a doorway on a Sunday morning meant. I went and sat at the kitchen table and picked up the crossword and asked if she needed help with 6 across. She said she always needed help with 6 across. I looked at the clue. I gave her the answer. Outside, the October light was coming through the window the way light comes through windows in the fall in Connecticut, golden and slightly elegiac, the kind that makes you think about time passing and then decide that time passing is okay. Actually, that time passing is how things become what they become, and that the distance between the person you were and the person you are is not a loss, but a record. I sat in the kitchen of a house that was becoming mine and thought about the note, the folded piece of paper from the back of a notebook, the quiet walk down 2 flights of stairs in my socks, the slide of paper under a door, the most important thing I had ever done, which had looked from the outside like almost nothing at all.